The dispute began long before the first wooden post struck the soil, before the neighbor's hammer echoed across the quiet suburban cul-de-sac, and before the homeowner felt the first flicker of disbelief that would later turn into a simmering, strategic resolve. It started with a feeling subtle at first, of someone pressing too close, of a boundary being tested, stretched, and ultimately crossed without permission. The property line had been a settled matter for decades, recorded meticulously in county documents, etched into old surveys, and woven into the neighborhood's memory as something as unchanging as the trees that shaded it. But in the mind of one neighbor, a man who had recently moved in with a brisk arrogance and a taste for dominance, those lines were apparently negotiable. The homeowner, who had lived on that plot for 15 years, had always appreciated the quiet predictability of their yard. The back garden, with its small vegetable patch and narrow stone path, had been a place of refuge. Even the modest patch of grass along the edge, though rarely used, felt unquestionably theirs. It wasn't grand, but it was home, a place shaped carefully over time, a place that had hosted countless evenings of calm reflection. So when the new neighbor moved in and began eyeing that narrow strip of land with an intensity that felt prying, it was hard not to sense that trouble might be on the horizon. That it began innocently enough. The neighbor wandered near the border more than most, sometimes standing with arms folded as if assessing terrain. Occasionally he paced along the hedge, running his fingers across the leaves, leaving behind broken stems that dropped into the homeowner's yard. There was something possessive about his behavior, as though he believed the land existed simply waiting to be claimed. Still, the homeowner tried to ignore it. After all, people behaved strangely during big moves. Stress could manifest in odd habits. Perhaps that was all it was. But one afternoon, while returning from an errand, the homeowner saw something that immediately dissolved any lingering optimism. A stack of lumber lay neatly piled beside the neighbor's driveway, accompanied by buckets of concrete mix, metal brackets, and several long beams, the unmistakable materials of a fence project. There was no request, no courtesy message, no discussion of shared boundaries or intentions, just supplies waiting to be assembled. A faint unease curled in the homeowner's stomach, but still no assumptions were made. That restraint, however, lasted only until the first morning the construction began at dawn. The sharp, insistent pounding of a hammer jolted through the quiet streets. The homeowner stepped outside, expecting to see a fence going up along the neighbor's yard. Somewhere safe, somewhere appropriate. Instead, what they saw made their pulse lurch. The neighbor had dug holes well past the property line, intruding blatantly onto land that wasn't his. He worked with full confidence, pressing each post into soil that did not belong to him, moving with the casual entitlement of someone who believed consequences were for other people. He didn't glance up, didn't pause, didn't seem to consider that his actions were anything but justified. The homeowner walked along the edge of the yard, studying the placement of the posts. They were not inches across the boundary, nor even a few feet. The intrusion was significant, enough to claim a chunk of land the homeowner had maintained for years. The sight of fresh dirt, the smell of cut lumber, the unmistakable permanence of the posts already cemented in place. It all blended into a surreal scene of violation. And yet, the neighbor continued, humming to himself as if he were simply improving his property, rather than stealing someone else's. The HOA offered no immediate relief. They insisted the matter was a civil issue and encouraged both parties to communicate constructively. The homeowner tried, but the neighbor dismissed every attempt at reasoning. He insisted that the line was clearly wrong, that he had researched it thoroughly, and that he had every right to reclaim misallocated land. He spoke with such unwavering conviction that, for a moment, the homeowner wondered if perhaps there had been a mistake, that somehow the surveys, the documents, the county records had all been wrong for decades. But after reviewing the paperwork, every measurement confirmed what they already knew. The land was theirs. For days, frustration simmered. Each new plank added to the encroaching fence felt like a fresh insult, a testament to the neighbor's disregard for boundaries both physical and social. Even after the fence was completed, towering, imposing, and brazenly positioned, the homeowner held back from rash decisions. They watched as the neighbor admired his work with smug satisfaction, hands on hips, looking for all the world like someone who believed he had achieved a personal victory. But the homeowner was not the type to respond with anger alone. In the quiet nights that followed, they scoured county records, pored through local property laws, and reviewed old survey maps with meticulous care. Each document confirmed the same truth. The neighbor had built an illegal structure on someone else's land. Still, the homeowner knew that simply demanding its removal might not be enough. The neighbor was stubborn, unyielding even, and likely to battle fiercely against any attempt to restore the rightful boundary. The homeowner needed something stronger, something irrefutable, something final. And then, late one evening, while reading through an article about unconventional property dispute resolutions, a spark of inspiration flickered. It was subtle at first, just an idea, a whisper of possibility, but it grew rapidly into something far more concrete. Plan. A clever, legally airtight, utterly devastating plan. Instead of fighting to remove the fence, the homeowner realized they could use the fence itself as leverage, converting the neighbor's arrogance into a trap he had built with his own hands. The thought took hold with surprising clarity. The homeowner didn't need to destroy the fence. They didn't even need to move it. All they needed to do was adjust ownership, specifically ownership of the soil beneath it. If the neighbor wanted to lay claim to that land so badly, perhaps he could. At a price. A steep one. The idea was bold, unconventional, and perfectly tailored to turn the situation upside down. It required careful execution, steps taken precisely, quietly, and strategically. But if everything went according to plan, the neighbor would soon regret every nail he had hammered into that stolen ground. By the end of the week, the homeowner had already begun gathering the documents necessary to set the plan in motion. It would take time, patience, and an unshakable commitment to seeing justice done. But they felt something they hadn't felt since the ordeal began. Control. The fence still stood arrogantly, cutting across the yard like a scar. But now, instead of provoking anger, it fueled determination. The neighbor had crossed a boundary, and soon he would discover just how costly that decision would become. The plan unfolded slowly, with deliberate precision and an attention to detail that mirrored the homeowner's rising determination. The neighbor, in his overconfidence, had assumed the matter was settled, that his fence, now firmly rooted in the soil he had commandeered, would remain untouched and unchallenged. He strutted along his side of the structure, admiring its height and strength as if it were some testament to his dominance. He had no idea that every step he took on that stretch of ground was already becoming the foundation of his undoing. The homeowner began by revisiting old property documents, scanning carefully through deeds, plats, and maps. They confirmed once more that the strip of land beneath the neighbor's fence belonged solely to them. The measurements were accurate, decades old, and legally uncontested. Still, for what the homeowner intended next, they needed absolute clarity, no approximations, no ambiguities. After all, this plan depended on precision as much as it depended on legal leverage. A licensed surveyor was hired discreetly. The homeowner made sure to schedule the work during hours when the neighbor typically left home. The surveyor arrived with equipment in tow, tripods, electronic measuring tools, brightly colored flags. The stakes were hammered into the ground one by one, each marking the indisputable boundary that the neighbor had violated. The homeowner watched silently as the surveyor meticulously traced the line, confirming once and for all that the fence stood squarely on the homeowner's land. When the surveyor handed over the final report, stamped and certified, it felt like holding the key to a vault of possibilities. The report was not only accurate but legally binding. It was the proof needed to proceed with a strategy that most homeowners would never dare to consider. The next step was research. The homeowner immersed themselves in local property laws, statutes about easements, adverse possession, encroachments, and most importantly, the sale of subdivided land. Though the strip of soil in question was small, the law permitted its sale as a microlot if properly documented, registered, and approved. It was an obscure but entirely legitimate process, often used when homeowners wanted to expand driveways, adjust landscaping boundaries, or clean up irregular property lines. But in this case, it would be used for something else entirely. To sell the land beneath the fence, the homeowner needed to finalize a few things: a boundary adjustment request, a microlot creation form, and a visit to the county assessor's office. This process could be tedious, and it certainly required patience, but the homeowner approached each step with unwavering resolve. After all, this wasn't about convenience. It was about justice delivered through the clever use of law. When the paperwork was filed, the homeowner kept the intentions quiet. The neighbor had no clue that the land under his fence was about to become a separate parcel. One that the homeowner could sell to anyone they wished. And not just anyone. The homeowner already had the perfect buyer in mind. There was a quiet satisfaction in choosing someone the neighbor would find deeply inconvenient. The buyer was a local business owner who specialized in rental properties, someone known for strict regulations, keen attention to detail, and a penchant for using every inch of acquired land for profitable purposes. The arrangement would be simple. The homeowner would sell the microlot, and the new owner would then hold full rights to the ground beneath the fence. Those rights, of course, would include making demands of the neighbor that he could not legally refuse. When the buyer agreed to the purchase, the deal was finalized with surprising speed. The sale price wasn't high, it didn't need to be. The value of this move wasn't in the profit. It was in the leverage. The homeowner sat back, reviewing the signed transfer documents with a sense of calm triumph. The land was no longer theirs. It now belonged to someone who would enforce its use with meticulous precision. And any structure built on that land, including the neighbor's entire fence, was now sitting illegally on property that did not belong to him. Meanwhile, the neighbor continued living in blissful ignorance. He believed his fence marked a new era in his dominion over the cul-de-sac. He had even begun making changes to his yard that reflected his inflated sense of ownership. He expanded his garden beds outward, added decorative stones that pushed even further onto the disputed land, and started storing equipment near the fence line as though he had claimed territory by sheer force of will. But the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The new microlot owner wasted no time. He sent the neighbor an official notice, polite, formal, and undeniably firm. The letter explained that the fence, now located entirely on his newly purchased property, represented an unauthorized structure. The neighbor was given two options: either remove the fence immediately at his own expense, or enter into a land use agreement that came with monthly rental fees far higher than any reasonable person would willingly pay. The shock on the neighbor's face when he received the letter rippled subtly across the neighborhood. Though he tried to hide his reaction, his pacing, furious muttering, and repeated rereading of the notice made his panic clear. His pride, the towering wooden monument built on stolen land, had become a legal liability overnight. But what rattled him most wasn't the demand for payment or removal. It was the undeniable legitimacy of the paperwork attached. Survey maps, boundary certifications, county approvals, and a lawful transfer of ownership. All of it airtight, all of it undeniable. The neighbor stormed through the neighborhood seeking sympathy, but found none. Many residents knew the homeowner well and had seen the meticulous care they took with their property. Others had their own grievances with the neighbor's arrogance. Some simply enjoyed watching his certainty crumble under the weight of legal consequences he had brought upon himself as the neighbor's frustration escalated. He attempted to argue that the land sale was unfair, unethical, even fraudulent. But the law did not care about fairness in emotion, it cared about fairness in documentation. And every document favored the homeowner's strategy. With each passing day, the neighbor's options shrank as he tried to negotiate, but the landowner's conditions were unwavering. The rental amount was exorbitant, intentionally so, and there was no room for compromise. Removal of the fence was permitted but would require careful dismantling and restoration of the soil, an expensive and time-consuming process. And all the while, the homeowner watched with quiet satisfaction. Not gloating, not bragging, simply observing as justice unfolded exactly as planned. The neighbor's arrogance had led him to build a fence on someone else's land. Now he was trapped, not by the fence itself, but by the consequences he had never imagined. He had wanted to claim the land. Now he would pay for it, literally. And yet, the final confrontation had not yet arrived. The breaking point, the moment when the neighbor's pride would collide with unavoidable reality, was still on the horizon. And on certain evenings, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the yard, the homeowner would glance at the property line and feel a quiet, almost poetic satisfaction. Boundaries, after all, existed for a reason. And when someone crossed them with arrogance, there were always consequences waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes through conflict, sometimes through law, and sometimes through a strategy so precise and unexpected that it turned a simple fence into a costly lesson. In the end, the land remained exactly where it had always been. What changed was the understanding of ownership, respect, and the cost of ignoring both. The fence had been built without permission, but its removal stood as a monument to a truth the neighbor could no longer deny. Some lines are drawn not just in soil, but in principle, and crossing them always comes with a price. The neighbor's downward spiral did not happen in an instant. Rather, it unfolded in a slow, inevitable arc. One that began with denial, slid into panic, and settled, finally, into a desperate scramble to salvage pride that had been cracked far more deeply than any fence post he had driven into the soil. Morning after morning, he paced beside the towering structure that had once filled him with triumph. Now it loomed over him with an oppressive weight, a constant reminder that what he had built without permission had become the very trap ensnaring him. He measured distances, re-examined the official documents he had received, consulted hastily purchased online resources, and even scribbled notes on a clipboard as though sheer effort might flip reality back into something less humiliating. But reality remained unmoved. The fence stood squarely on land he did not own, land he could not access without someone else's permission, land that had been purchased specifically to force his hand. The buyer who now owned the microlot maintained the same meticulous posture he used in all his rental dealings. His notices remained polite but firm, increasing in urgency as deadlines passed. First came the reminder, then the warning, then the notification of impending legal action. Each document was stamped with precision, worded with clarity, and carried a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. The neighbor, once so confident, now found himself backed into a corner with two unappealing options: dismantle the fence at great cost, or pay a monthly rental fee so outrageous it would strain his finances beyond comfort. Pride urged him to reject both options. Reality pressed him to choose one before consequences compounded further. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood watched with unspoken fascination. They noticed how his shoulders slumped more each day, how his voice, once loud and commanding, became clipped and tense. They saw how he avoided eye contact, no longer eager to boast about the improvements he was making to his property. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. The man who had once marched with certainty now walked with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield of his own creation. The homeowner, for their part, kept a respectful distance. They had no need to rub salt in the wound. The process itself was lesson enough. They simply observed the situation unfold, maintaining their routines with quiet satisfaction. Each time they glanced at the fence, they no longer felt anger or frustration, only a sense of closure growing nearer by the day. The decisive turning point came when the neighbor received the formal notice that a lien would be placed on his property if he failed to resolve the encroachment within a set period. This was no idle threat. The documents were legitimate, the timeline official, and the consequences unavoidable. Ignoring them would not simply be a matter of pride. It would jeopardize his home, his finances, his future. For the first time, he realized that the structure he had built without permission had graduated from an annoyance to a legal time bomb. He could no longer pretend that stubbornness would bring about a victory. He had crossed a line, literally, and now the law had tightened around him like a vice. It was on a quiet, overcast morning that he finally conceded. Before the sun had fully risen, he stepped outside carrying tools he had once held with pride. The hammer, the crowbar, the electric drill, all now symbols of a mistake he had no choice but to undo. He approached the fence with visible reluctance, pausing before each screw as though hoping for a last-minute miracle. But no miracle came. Instead, he began to dismantle the fence plank by plank, each removal a quiet admission of guilt. Panels that had gone up with smugness now came down with resignation. The once imposing structure shrank piece by piece, its gradual disappearance mirroring the unraveling of the neighbor's inflated ego. It was a long, laborious process. The cemented posts, stubborn and unyielding, required hours of work to extract. The soil beneath them, still belonging to the microlot owner, had to be carefully leveled and restored according to the specifications outlined in the agreement. Sweat dripped from his forehead, clothing soaked through, his movements driven not by pride but by necessity. The homeowner watched from a distance, not out of spite, but out of closure. The fence's slow collapse marked the end of a conflict that had begun with arrogance and was now ending with accountability. It wasn't triumph that the homeowner felt. It was relief. Not dramatic, not boastful, just a quiet exhale of justice finally served. When the last fence post was removed, the neighbor stood for a long moment, staring at the empty patch of land as though unable to accept that the boundary he had tried to claim had never been his. The yard looked smaller now, not in size but in spirit. The absence of the fence revealed more than just open space. It revealed a lesson carved into the very ground he had tried to seize. The microlot owner inspected the area shortly after, ensuring that all conditions had been met. Satisfied, he filed the final paperwork withdrawing the pending lien. Then, with a nod of professional courtesy, he left the neighbor to confront the aftermath. The homeowner eventually approached the restored stretch of land. It looked bare, but clean, almost like a blank page. The boundary stakes from the survey still stood, marking the true property line with thin strips of bright flagging. For the homeowner, those markers symbolized more than just a border. They represented clarity, respect, and the power of knowledge applied with precision. In the days that followed, the neighborhood's rhythm returned to normal, though the story of the fence's rise and fall lived on in quiet conversations. Some spoke of it as a warning, others as an example of clever problem-solving. And many admired the homeowner's ability to remain calm, strategic, and unwavering in the face of blatant provocation. As for the neighbor, he became noticeably quieter. He tended to his yard with a subdued demeanor, no longer pushing boundaries, literal or social. The arrogance had faded, replaced by a cautiousness that came from learning an expensive lesson. His fence was gone, but the consequences lingered. Legal fees, wasted supplies, hours of labor, and the knowledge that arrogance had cost him dearly. The homeowner did not celebrate his downfall. They simply returned to the peaceful routine they had cherished before the intrusion began. They replanted flowers along the restored border, watered the soil where the posts once stood, and allowed nature to reclaim the space with gentle persistence. In time, the incident became just another story, albeit one with lasting impact.